All right, so one of the things I always want students to come away from the introductory unit on philosophy understanding is some of the basic subfields that we'll be studying over the semester. So there are a couple different ways you might introduce philosophy. We've talked about some different definitions of philosophy. Might have introduced the Socratic method as a way of doing philosophy. But there are also another way you could come at it is by thinking about the basic subfields of academic philosophy. So these are the topics, the broad topics that we'll be, or subfields that we'll be studying over the course of the semester. So the first one here will be kind of fairly maybe familiar to everyone, but the other ones maybe less so. So I'm gonna boil it down to just four basic subfields: logical reasoning, or just logic and critical thinking; epistemology; metaphysics; and axiology. You've probably heard the terms logical reasoning and critical thinking before, although you might not quite have a full understanding of kind of more theoretical logic or something like that. Practical reasoning, we talk about logic that way as well. But when philosophers study logic, they're studying formal logic, different types of logic like deductive logic versus inductive logic, and when reasoning goes astray, so things like fallacies and various methods for trying to avoid fallacies and so forth. So logic is just one of the main areas of philosophy. Then we have epistemology, which is a fancy way of studying the theory of knowledge. Episteme means knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Then we have metaphysics, which is basically the study of the nature of reality. So again, very broad category there. Lots of things go under that. Everything from the nature of the human person to whether or not there's an afterlife or whether a God exists or not. Those are metaphysical questions. Then we have another broad category, axiology. So that's the study of values. And again, very broad category. Lots of things go under that, from aesthetic and philosophy of art type questions to moral and political questions. So a little bit more about each of these basic subfields. So again, logic, critical thinking. In philosophy, one of the basic, probably one of the most important distinctions in all of philosophy is the difference between believing on the basis of good reasoning versus believing on the basis of bad reasoning. And so what are the standards of good and bad reasoning? How are we to evaluate reasoning? Well, that's what logic studies, logicians in particular. And so you'll probably be using logic a lot this semester. You'll be reading people using logic, and you'll probably also be using logic as well on some of the assignments that you're given. So logic for us means the study of proper reasoning, and so and argumentation. And so what we'll be doing probably very early on this semester is looking at different types of, some basic things about different types of reasoning, like deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning, some forms of deductive reasoning versus, and then some types of inductive reasoning as well, like inductive generalization or argument by analogy. We might also be talking a little bit about what's called abductive reasoning, or reasoning to the best explanation. And we'll be covering some errors of reasoning, some fallacies. There are other sorts of errors in reasoning as well, but fallacies are logical errors in arguments. So that's what you'll be studying, and then applying those to problems in all of these other areas of philosophy, right? Because we're going to be worried about knowledge, arguments over the nature of knowledge, or arguments over the nature of human persons, or again human nature, or the nature of consciousness, and so forth. So logic, central to pretty much all areas of philosophy. So next main area, epistemology, or the study of knowledge. So what justifies a belief? What is rationality? What are the criteria for distinguishing genuine knowledge from mere opinion? These are all epistemological questions and at the heart of the study of the nature of knowledge. So later on this semester, we'll probably look at the challenge of skepticism about the external world. Can we have propositional knowledge of the external world? What kind of knowledge do we mean there? Do we mean that you have to be, it can't be possible that you could be wrong in order for a claim to qualify as knowledge versus an opinion? Those sorts of questions. Then we'll also be worried about metaphysics, or the study of the nature of reality and existence. So here, just what is the nature of reality? Is reality made up of all matter energy, or are there non-physical parts to nature as well? Is there such a thing as supernatural beings? Do they exist? Do abstract numbers exist? Or are they dependent on human minds? What makes the human person the same person over time? A metaphysical question there. Or what's the nature of consciousness, and how does the physical body relate to a non-physical mind if we have one? All of these are metaphysical questions. Then last here, in terms of our main areas, we've got axiology. And again, a very broad category. It means the study of values, and that could be aesthetic values having to do with art or pleasurable experiences, all the way to moral and political values, like questions about the nature of justice, freedom, what justifies limits on freedom, if anything. What's the value of art? What's the nature of aesthetic experience? What is moral goodness? All of these are value questions. So when philosophers deal with values, we're also worried about, the normativity of values and their relationship to reason. So, is being moral rational? A key question there about value. Then we got some other things to consider as well. There's a philosophy of, fill in your favorite area of academic study, and there's probably philosophers worried about a conceptual question that's raised in that discipline, but not studied by that discipline itself. So, for example, key question in the philosophy of science is, what is the difference between science and non-science or pseudoscience? And while scientists often have some views about that, they don't really focus as much as philosophers on the conceptual side of that question. They're more engaged in the practice of experimentation, rather than worried about the conceptual issues there. So, it's a central question in the philosophy of science. Artists are usually concerned with the process of making art and not as much concerned with the conceptual problem of how to define art, for example. And so, you have lots of different other subfields of philosophy, where it's basically the philosophy of some other discipline. So, for example, the philosophy of religion studies questions about the rationality of religious belief and claims about religious knowledge or the nature of religious experience. And it's at the intersection of, epistemological claims and metaphysical claims that arise because of religion. So, that's where a whole other little subfield comes in there. So we've got the philosophy of other disciplines, and then we've got, philosophy related to all other sorts of topics, including things like conspiracy theories, climate change, pandemics, popular culture, or other current events. So you can find philosophers worried about, when, if ever, is it rational to believe a conspiracy theory? Are all conspiracy theories irrational, right? You can worry about the philosophical issues related to climate change. Again, science versus non-science and pseudoscience plays a role there, as well as our obligations to the environment, if we have such things. We could worry about, pandemics and the questions that those things raise about, individual liberty and government intervention. We could worry about, maybe less of a worry than pandemics, but, how philosophy is related to popular culture. We'll find that there are lots of philosophical ideas in our everyday lives, as well as philosophical elements to popular culture or other current events. You might worry, for example, about, what, if anything, does one country owe the Ukraine simply because they're in favor of kind of the broad type of government that they both have an affinity for? What obligations to foreign aid should our government have or not have? That's a philosophical question, right, about governmental policy. So studying philosophy, can be daunting to many people, but I think it's important to realize, that philosophical questions and ideas are all around us. We're worried about reasoning. We give reasons often throughout the day. We consider other people's reasons throughout the day. Philosophy is concerned with good and bad reasoning. You can find an area of philosophy that where philosophers have dealt with, whatever topic you might personally be interested in. Philosophers have probably spent a little bit of time investigating that. So, you can learn a lot about other topics that you may be interested in from philosophers as well. You learn about yourself that way, learn about what you think about that issue through engaging, the perspectives of others about those topics. So studying philosophy, again, certainly involves studying some abstract and theoretical questions, but often those theoretical questions are really grounded in very practical matters. And to just kind of end here and follow up on that point, here's a little passage from Simon Blackburn's book, Think, which is an introduction to philosophy. And he says, we might wonder whether what we say is objectively true or merely the outcome of our own perspective or our own take on a situation. Thinking about these, we confront categories like knowledge, objectivity, and truth, and we may want to think about them. And at that point, we're reflecting on concepts and procedures and beliefs that we normally just use. We're looking at the scaffolding of our thought and doing conceptual engineering, that's his term, conceptual engineering for philosophy. So we make claims about knowing things all day, but we generally don't worry so much about what we mean by knowledge when we employ that term. And when we start to reflect upon the things we've been making assumptions about and the things that we're just using rather than reflecting upon themselves, then we're starting to do some philosophy right there. So again, getting started doing philosophy as well is pretty easy. It's doing philosophy well that becomes very challenging. So I hope here what we've done is just provide you with a little bit of an overview of the basic subfields of academic philosophy that you'll be looking at over the course of the semester. Again, this is just one of the main things I really want students to get out of the introductory material is an understanding of those basic subfields. All right, see you in the next one.